didn't even get through my spam filter. And so it is a relationship-driven business also. And so building that trust where I know George will not, he knows my process, I know his process. We're often on the opposite side of the table negotiating against each other, but we understand each other. And I would be happy to engage with George or any company that he's working with. And again, that's true for a small number of companies, but not all bankers are great people.
Excuse me, I didn't pay him for that.
Excuse me. It's kind of interesting what's being said here around the fact that those relationships, both for acquisitions, banking, but actually even for investments, is about it's about staying top of mind, getting visible, helping people. And it's a lot of intangible things that you have to do regularly so that you're in a good position when the time comes.
Yeah, just to quickly expand on that. So you think about competitive advantage from a service provider point of view. You think about competitive advantage from a company point of view. As a company and as individuals, in our world, I was down at a big company in Atlanta on Wednesday, and I asked them this question: how many people actually do what they say they're going to do? You know what the answer is? 10%. Right? So my whole strategy as a banker is to be in the 10%. Leave me aside for a second. As companies, right, if you do what you say you're going to do, it's the fastest way to build trust with whoever you're sitting across from. Some of that's with your customers, some of it's with your commercial partners, some of it's with your investors, whoever it is. We all get told to say please and thank you. We should always also get told to do what we say we're going to do.
So I see a lot of questions. So I'm going to go this way and then that one.
I have just one quick question and then a little big one perhaps. What is, I see tech up there all the time. I'm not tech. So I usually end up in these rooms and I always wonder whether this is agnostic or not. Or is it mostly about tech? My business is hospitality, for instance, right? Is it different or is it pretty much the same?
So it's hard for me to tell because I just do tech. But if you think we're all smart people, right? Well, you guys are smart people. I'm less smart. I'm straight. If you think about the way people interact, whether you're a tech person interacting with a tech person or a hospitality person interacting with a hospitality person, what are the ways, how do people interact and how do people get to want to do a deal? I gotta believe it's the same way. Now, there are some parts of the world where how you do that are different. Everyone knows the stereotypical South Korean meeting gets done over, I was going to say sake, but I guess it's not sake. Whatever, gets drunk in South Korea or in the restaurant after the meeting. The meeting itself is kind of a formality, but business gets done after hours, right? So there's lots of examples like that of how things get done are actually different. But I think at the end of the day, human interaction is human interaction, and people want to do business with people they like. Again, if you do what you say you're going to do, and if you subscribe to the notion, at least in this exit, M&A context, which by the way is also true in the IPO context, right? Why IPO investors buy companies, for the most part, is because they look the guy in the eye, or the lady in the eye, and they believe what they're saying. It's a trust-based interaction.
I was going to take a stab at your answer because uniquely, although I work in tech, I work in corp dev forums and talk to other people about my job at different companies. And one of my coworkers was sitting with the head of corp dev for Starbucks and describing theirs, which is much more hospitality focused. And the process they go through, it's the same. They look at different things, like they'll look at customer acquisition costs and customer retention costs, which I don't do as much because I have giant enterprise customers. I look through different things. But overall, the process, yeah, it's the same.
When you talked about the biz dev approach versus corporate dev approach, you said the trick is to share sufficient information, right? At that point, is this information protected already, or what kind of information are you seeing exchanged during that phase? Because entrepreneurs typically keep the information close to, channels.
So the first part of the answer is, again, what we talked about before, which is you have to be comfortable sharing a certain level of information. You just do, right? So generally speaking, for early stage stuff, what do we share with people? We share how much capital has been raised. We share what's the valuation of the last round. We share some details of the cap table. who owns what, right? And that stuff, some people are really proprietary about that. At the end of the day, a lot of that stuff gets made public anyway, right? You can go to Crunchbase and find most of this stuff. Some of the things that you obviously need to be able to tell people to understand the business model, and sometimes, we sell a lot of, less here, but in my prior firm, we sold a lot of pre-revenue companies. Also, there's no revenue number to give, right? So what are you giving? You're giving enough color. Todd just mentioned there's some assets where understanding customer acquisition cost is really critical to the buyer's analysis, so you're going to have to share something. You can share ranges, you can share ballparks, you can share run rates. There's lots of ways of positioning information where at the end of the day, it's not going to kill you if it gets in the public domain.
Could you share a business plan, for example, at this stage?
Maybe, so if you're pre-revenue, what the monetization model is, would look like once you get to monetization. What's your formula for generating revenue? What's the go-to-market? What's the margin profile? All those key elements of the specific business model. At a high level, sure. If you've got revenue, what your revenue is, where it's coming from, what the growth rate is. Depending on who the buyer is and the investor, they'll look for different things. And it's all situation specific. The point, I think, is you have to understand that unless you're a super duper hot company and people can just take a flyer on you, you're going to have to give them a little bit. Yeah.
Just wait for the microphone.
How do you think about the implications of having a corporate VC or VCs on your cap table for M&A, both vis-a-vis those specific groups and then your option set universe more broadly?
So I mentioned before that a term sheet's not a term sheet, and so it's a good time to talk about some of the key things going on in exits right now because it has direct bearing on your cap table. So there's lots of lawyers can fill you in on all of this stuff, but one of the big hot buttons these days for buyers who've realized that the last, up until 3 or 4 years ago, 10 years before that, the way they were buying companies left them in certain instances in a bad spot, is around retention. So Todd mentioned before that there's a guy that came in through an acquisition and now runs the biggest security business in the world, which is embedded in IBM. Right? They're the guys that buyers want. The way that you get the entrepreneurs to stick around is what's called retention. How you get people to stay is contractual. So there is a concept which we call bifurcation of purchase price, right? Where purchase price gets allocated to the cap table in a certain instance, and then the balance gets allocated to retention. So let's just say the transaction value is $10 million, just as an example. A buyer could come and say, I'm going to allocate $5 million to the cap table. So you do your waterfall based on the ownership percentages of the $5 million. The second $5 million gets allocated to the key employees, which gets negotiated with the team. Make sense? And then that $5 million, that second $5 million gets paid out on a vesting schedule. So you might get a third over 3 years. Where M&A out of VC-backed companies, where it's not a home run, can become really difficult and have really difficult internal conversations, is when a buyer tries to allocate a significant portion of the purchase price to retention versus the cap table. So to answer your question, when you have institutions involved, invariably, unless it's an absolute home run, you're going to have some really difficult conversations. That's kind of one way to answer your question. Another way to answer the question in this BD context, how do you actually get to someone like a business person at IBM? A lot of VCs should be able to help with that. The reality is actually not many can. Except for all those in this room, of course. So that's where you want to use your ecosystem to help you get to the right person on a biz dev conversation. Doesn't look like that answered your question, though.
No, I guess what I was trying to get at was, at Series B, C stage, whatever, you take on, a corporate investor or investors, and maybe they have some info rights, they get to know you better than others, just kind of, and then years forward, you're looking to sell the business. I'm just kind of curious as to sort of your experience, observations as to how that then plays out. Does it tend to be in 90% of cases it's someone who's it's a corporate who's already invested who winds up taking out the company? How does it affect the exits down the road?
It totally depends. So you got to think about why does in a corporate VC context, why does the corporate want to have an investing arm to begin with? And not all corporate VCs are made equal. Some of them are because there's a guy who wants to do that and he negotiates with the CEO and he gets allowed to do it. If you look at Salesforce, who probably is the best at this, why do they have a VC arm? In part, it's because then they have an what's the right word, where it's unfiltered view into what's going on in the ecosystem, right? Not from a competitive point of view, but from a trend perspective. And then, whether they have roofers or not, they've effectively bought themselves an option to buy.
I have a couple of quick questions before getting more from the floor. So this fantastic, how much does it cost?
To hire a bank?
Yes.
So the answer is it depends. So most firms will have minimums that they try to achieve. So depending on the size scale, you could be 3%.
Is it a retainer? Yeah.
So there's lots of different models, of course. So the way that we typically do things is no retainers, because retainers, one could argue that a retainer shows that the bank has no confidence in their own ability or in the quality of the company. So we don't do retainers, which is not throwing stones, but anyone who wants to charge you a retainer, come talk to us. So success fee based, customary reimbursement for expenses, and then some spread formula. It could be a straight spread on purchase price. It could be 3%, right? It could be a ladder, 3% up to 50, an additional 3%, 50 to 100, etc. So the pricing of it, you get multiple different answers to the question. Where people tend to get hung up is, they say, on smaller deal values, where the minimums become a really big percentage of the transaction value. And that's where sometimes you have to go down the size scale in terms of organization to find an advisor who will be willing to take a fee which doesn't represent 10, 15, 20% of the purchase price.
So I guess the idea is that even if you take 10% of a deal, if you can help double the outcome, then, well,
right.
I'm going to pay for myself.
Right, exactly. So there's lots of ways that sales guys use to convince people to buy product. Right, you guys are all sales guys. How do you convince someone to buy your product? We can price things creatively to get hired.
I have one other quick question. So is it customary among your customers to run in parallel a fundraising track, like a VC track, and an acquisition track? And how does that work?
Yeah. So yes is the answer. And that actually can create a really good story, which is, I'm not hanging a for sale sign around my neck. So try this on for a script. Company's doing great. We've raised X in capital. We're growing at Y. In the next 9 to 12 months, we're going to come to a crossroads where we either raise capital or we find a strategic home for the business. Right. So what does the buyer do? Most buyers these days are, have cottoned on to the fact that when someone delivers that message, actually they're for sale. But if you are really thoughtful about the existing investors and you get them to do the work such that they don't leave you in a bad position with your back against the wall on the sale process, i.e. you don't run out of money, that additional runway, even if they want to sell, getting them to be prepared to fund the business for some extended period of time, that's common sense. Most people wait until the last minute on that, and then it doesn't work out. So as I said before, there's lots of things, if you just read the tea leaves, and it's hard sometimes, this is what we do, you guys run companies. What you never want to do is find yourself with the back against the wall. And so you just got to be constantly looking 6, 9, 12 months out and having those conversations along the way so you don't find yourself in a difficult position.
I guess this is a question possibly for both gentlemen. Is there currently kind of a sweet spot in kind of the valuation, the numbers that just make deals easier to complete currently?
I don't think so. I think, look, at the end of the day, does it matter for a Google or a Facebook if they buy a company that's 100 million or a billion? No. Does it matter for Microsoft if they spend 20 million versus 7.5 billion in stock? When's the last time you saw a multi-billion-dollar tech company or deal of a tech company buy a private target in stock? Like never, right? So it depends.
Patterson here once again, founder, director, CTO, Funeral, the official funeral app. Always an honor to be in the New York Times building here. Love it. Avid reader of the Times since I was 10 years old. With regards to NDAs, right? Once again, NDAs. I have my holder and my UX designer both signed multiple copies of NDAs. You're saying this is not somewhat enforceable. Is it enforceable? I have an attorney on retainer. What would happen if something were to be breached? Would that be a problem? Like, how would that go into effect? How would that work?
I'm trying not to give you what would be interpreted as a flippant answer, which is go ask your lawyer. So we talked about NDAs in the context of information sharing in an M&A scenario, which I think is a little bit different than what you just outlined with your own employees. Ask Elon Musk how to deal with employees who go external with stuff, right? Because it's playing out right now. I think the point on NDAs with potential buyers is a slightly different point. What you need to balance is their perception of being asked to sign an NDA too early in the process versus what you want, which is to have some legally binding document that they don't take information to their own benefit, which hurts you. And that's always a dance. What we typically tell people is there's got to be some level of information you're willing to provide outside of an NDA. As a banker, when we go to IBM, if we send IBM a presentation that has confidential, just the word confidential written on the front, they're not allowed to do anything with it. Right? So we have to, we as representing people have to say, if you want IBM to look at your materials, you've got to get comfortable with the fact that you take the confidential stamp off. At least some level of base information.
So, for a typical investment bank, at what stage in a tech company's existence does would an investment bank like to get involved with them and start working with them? And if that's, as you seem to suggest, that that's fairly early on in an ideal case, how do you go about finding, your deal flow, your potential companies, and then what stage, like, is what scale of a deal, like, does it make sense for an investment bank to work with a company?
So the last part first. So we talked before about minimums.
Yeah.
So all firms have kind of thresholds on what they try to earn, because at the end of the day, this is a person hour. It's a utilization rate times rate business that we're in, right? And because it's a success fee only based model, if you invest a ton of time with companies where there's no fee opportunity, the opportunity cost is working with companies who pay fees. So part of it depends on your own, what you like to do. Part of the size question is, if you just do the math, right? If you're got a $2 million minimum and the asset sells for $10 million, 20% of purchase price is banker fee. As a seller, are you willing to do that? Probably not. So people who have minimums, and if you're at different thresholds, essentially the size of the transaction dictates who you can work with. Does that make sense? So then from who do we spend time with? How do we decide what we like? A lot of it's personality driven. Some of it is, if my boss calls and says, hey, can you go talk to that company? I'm going to talk to that company. I don't know how he knew about it. If there are people who we can help, we try and help them, right? Because, again, I kind of alluded to this before, and you may say, geez, that's a bunch of BS, but you got to believe at some level in whatever you want to call it. I call it karma, because that's what most other people call it. If you get known in an ecosystem as being someone who's willing to help outside of a transaction scenario, good things happen.
What stage in the company's business do you like to get involved in?
It kind of depends on what the company is asking us to do to help. I'm trying to answer the question for you. So if say in the IPO market, right? So people have different perspectives, and let's say you need 100 million of revenue before you can go public. At what point do you want to get involved? The company's growing at really quickly, like 50, 100%. Getting involved a couple of years ahead of time puts you in a position by the time they're going public to have 2 years of history and 2 years of demonstrated that you know what you're doing and to help, right? Spending a lot of time with the guy who's drawing the idea on a napkin, that's not what I do. I can't be very helpful in that. So it's kind of a waste of the client's time. I'll give you an example of kind of how this works. So the other day, there's this company, CrowdStrike, which is in the press right now. They just raised a bunch of money, talking to the CFO about this biz dev thing, right? Guy says, okay, I'm going to Singapore next week. Let me see if you can do what you say you can do. He says, get me a half day of meetings. Right? And the next day we had him 3 days of meetings. So we called a bunch of our other clients and said, this company's coming over to Singapore. We're a customer. We know them well. We like them. Great team. You should take a meeting. What they're going to do, who knows? The press speculates they'll go public next year. That's a good time to get involved. Does that make sense?
I know Klaus, right? We should talk.
What time does it make? Sorry. So, when does it make sense to start shopping for deals? Do you wait for a term sheet or just expression of interest in early stages? Is that good enough to speak to other potential clients? Would you speak about that?
If I think I understand your question, although I'm not sure I understand your question, but let me pretend. So what we said before was, if you think about the biz dev process format as being one where you identify the 5 to 7 most likely buyers, you go to them under the guise of a commercial conversation as distinct from a buy me conversation. If through the course of those conversations, a corp dev guy says, geez, I really want to own this, they're going to make a call and say, hey, I want to have take our conversation to the next level and have a corp dev conversation. Okay? So you're going to do a little dance, they're going to give a number. Right? So then I think if I understood your question, at what point do you take that number and make those other calls? So that depends a little bit. If the buyer, the guy who makes the proposal gets the sense that you're going to shop his bid, that's not a good fact pattern. And if the buyer says, don't shop my bid, and you say, okay, I won't shop the bid, and then you do, you're close because you lied to the guy. So the first thing is never say that I won't shop the bid. The beauty is under the commercial construct, right? A lot of buyers will say, I don't want you to run a process off the back of me submitting an offer. If you run the BD play, you're never launching a process. Now, you could argue that it's semantics, but most people get comfortable with the fact that if you've had commercial conversations and someone makes a call and says, I want to buy the company, and then 2 or 3 other people come in and say, hey, I want to buy the company, you can tell the first guy, hey, look, you put in an unsolicited proposal based on a commercial conversation. We've had those conversations with 5 or 7 other people, and guess what? Coincidences happen. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yes. Recently, I had a very strange experience because I do very unique product. I'm fine art, and media. And I've been approached by Pepsi and Dolce Gabbana and Snack for the product I produce. And they had a proposal for redeveloping some products, which they got in one point where they cannot read.
So can you get to the point?
Yes. And I tried to merge some others to be able to approach them. Because they said, oh, we do a different business work this way, that way. Then the CEO of those companies, Frau and Capellini, Fornasetti, and Dolce Gabbana, they approached me and they interested in the product. Now I merging for different people to be able to land the deal.
What's the question?
The question is, in a process like that, when you had merging people who want to be part of the deal and to franchise the thing, okay, part of it, and you want to change those people who could not materialize the situation to be able to franchise.
Okay, George.
I'd be happy to try and answer your question, perhaps away from the group, because I'm not sure I understand it. What you're trying to ask is, how do you take a bunch of interest and catalyze it into a proposal?
Yeah, because
that's what you're trying to ask?
The reality is there, the customer is there. They couldn't come into a
I think we're a bit out of topic.
Yeah.
Let's have that conversation
yeah.
After the session.
Any other questions?
Question over there? Yeah.
That's the reality.
I just want to dig a little deeper on the retention methods that you mentioned before. One of the trends that you was the revesting for founder shares. Just wanted to better understand your perspective and what you're seeing in the marketplace there. Are you seeing that becoming a bigger percentage of deals, and what is the potential impact on those founders? There's some serious tax implications there.
Yeah. So again, it's all over the map. It depends on things like tax situations. So why did the guy at GitHub take $7.5 billion of Microsoft stock? What do you think the answer is? Does anyone know? Does everyone see the deal? Everyone in the room should see the deal. Why? Tax reasons, right? Defer, get rebased, right? That makes actually a lot of sense. So what I'll tell you is buyers are better at buying companies than most people are at selling companies. So buyers will try one on, right? If they know they're the only guy in the room, what negotiating leverage do you have other than saying, I don't want to do the deal? So some guys will come out and say 100% of purchase price is allocated to retention. If you've got VCs, that's not going to work, right? So, okay, that doesn't work. So then what's the right balance? When you're contemplating taking, if you think about consideration, cash versus stock, as a founder, you may have a buyer where you don't want to own their stock, right? You're happy to revest your cash, but you don't want to take stock as consideration. Depends who the buyer is. There may be a buyer where you're like, holy hell, this thing's going to be a rocket ship. I want the upside, right? So it's kind of all over the map. The issue, I think, which is less about what the mix is and all of that is, and as founders, you always got to be careful about this, is if you've got institutional shareholders, they think that you're telling the buyer what to propose to your own benefit to their detriment. And I will tell you that comes up a lot. And it's not that the VC or the institution doesn't trust the founder, it's just a bad fact pattern. So what you always want to make sure as a founder you don't get yourself sideways with your institutions on is ever them pointing the finger at you and say, this proposal, this mix came because you told them what to propose. That's the one which I think people just need to be cognizant of. It's like, just don't put yourself in a bad situation, right? That's why you use bankers and lawyers. You have them have that conversation. Because what Todd said before is this 5-year marriage. One of the reasons you use intermediaries is there are conversations you don't want to have as a founder because it's going to be confrontational and it can really pollute the working relationship that you want to have with the buyer going forward. So they're the conversations you get someone else to be the bad guy for. Things like this mix, all of that kind of stuff. There's reasons sometimes, like we sold this company and one of the co-founders was married, had a kid, another kid on the way, virtually wasn't taking a salary. The buyer wanted to give a bunch of stock. The guy's like, I can't pay my rent to live in New York anymore. I've gone through all my savings. Right? He had that conversation with the buyer because that was very personal. And they changed the mix so that he could stay working at the company. There are other conversations where it's better you have a bad guy. Does that answer your question?
Somebody asked me one of the questions of how do you negotiate for one of the different things. That's absolutely one of the ones that we do a lot is what does retention look like? What does deferred stock payouts look like? And how is that structured? That's often somewhat related to the financial structure of the company itself and what are we looking at from tax and accounting. Those different mechanisms for compensating someone have different accounting implications. Where do they hit IPTI? Do they go to a capital? So they have to play into a much larger picture of what does the full deal look like. But ultimately, our motivation at the end of the day when I'm trying to do a deal is to make everybody whole and everybody happy at the end of the day. If the seller walks away and it's like, thumbs up, that was great, I love it, I want to stay here and work for the next 20 years and create a giant business. Success. So that's what we're in good faith really working towards that goal.
Yeah, just to that point, there's an old saying that in a negotiation as distinct from a take it or leave it, right? So you take it or leave it isn't a negotiation by definition. In a negotiation, both guys want to feel they got screwed a little bit, right? That's the midpoint, right? If one guy gets all the benefit and the other guy gets really screwed, that's actually not a fair, good faith negotiation.
Yeah, I want to keep that.
Right.
So again, it sounds like optionality and leverage, but also like this kind of working relationship is really important. And in terms of process, like how early do you think founders should start kind of getting that on the agenda to kind of plan for potential future transactions?
So that's actually probably the number one question, right? Which is you've got 24 hours in a day. Some of you need to sleep a couple of hours. So let's just say you've got 20 hours in a day. How many hours are you supposed to be thinking about how you're going to exit the company versus building a company that has the option to exit? Right? That's probably harder than picking out wearing gray pants today. Where am I going to go on vacation? That's kind of an easier question to answer. It's just, that varies for everyone. I think you've just got to balance the idea that to have an option, you have to build something. Or you have to have a really good idea that you can understand how it's going to be built. It wouldn't make a ton of sense to spend 100% of your time thinking about how you're going to exit without focusing any attention on what you're creating. It's probably somewhere in between.
We're going to end on this because we're already went way over with questions. So first, thanks, George. That was a fantastic session.